A ceasefire was announced. Headlines called it progress. And then, almost immediately, missiles and drones were back in the sky. This wasn't just one deal falling apart. This was a warning flare. The world is adjusting to a new reality. U.S. diplomacy is no longer assumed to be steady, enforceable, or even credible. And the most important part, Europe isn't waiting around to find out if Washington can get it together. 2105, quick intro. Promise. Host. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I want to walk you through a moment that says a lot about where the United States stands right now in the world. Just days before ceasefire talks scheduled in Abu Dhabi, the U.S. negotiated pause between Ukraine and Russia collapsed. Russia resumed strikes, Ukraine retaliated, and the diplomatic effort, framed as a breakthrough, fell apart almost immediately. By the end of this video, you'll understand why ceasefires fail, why credibility is the real currency of diplomacy, and why Europe is building a security framework that can survive U.S. political volatility. Let's break it down. 5-2 to 20. Set the scene, the ceasefire that didn't hold host. The Trump administration promoted the ceasefire as progress, an agreement to pause attacks, particularly on energy infrastructure, while talks were set to resume in Abu Dhabi. Ukraine agreed cautiously. President Zelensky made clear it was conditional. He recognized how fragile it was, but Russia, according to the reporting and the sequence of events described, violated it quickly. Missile and drone attacks resumed within days. Power infrastructure was hit again. Civilian areas were struck during one of the harshest winter periods, and by the time diplomats were supposed to reconvene, the ceasefire was effectively meaningless. That right there is the whole problem. Per 335, the core rule of ceasefires: simple, powerful. Host. Here's the rule: nobody can escape. A ceasefire only works if all sides believe it will be enforced. Not announced, not marketed, not declared at a podium, enforced. Because if one side believes there's no cost for breaking it, then the ceasefire becomes what we just watched, a press cycle. Russia clearly did not behave like it expected enforcement, and that's what leads to the credibility issue. 5-15, the credibility crisis, the big theme. Host. For decades, U.S. diplomacy worked not because America was perfect, but because it was predictable. Allies believed U.S. guarantees would last beyond news cycles. Adversaries believed violations would carry consequences. Predictability is power, and right now, that predictability is gone. Instead, we get a pattern. Threats made publicly, negotiations announced impulsively, agreements floated without enforcement mechanisms, and when it falls apart, Washington moves on to the next headline. That's not strategic leadership. That's theater. And the world is responding accordingly. Hacker 640, why this collapse matters more than one, conflict host. Now, some people will say, so what? Ceasefires collapse all the time. True. But here's why this one matters. It's happening in the context of a wider global perception shift that U.S. commitments can change overnight depending on political incentives, and that forces allies to do what rational actors always do when a key partner becomes unpredictable. They build backups. That's what happened next. 49 Core 10, Europe's tiered security framework, clear breakdown. Host, according to reporting referenced in your segment, Ukraine has now secured a new tiered security framework involving NATO, the United States, and key EU member states. And this structure is deliberate. Tier 1, NATO plus Europe as the enforcement backbone. European and NATO-led commitments include long-term military assistance, intelligence sharing, integrated air and missile defense support. Rapid response coordination. If Russia violates future agreements, this tier is designed to function regardless of U.S. political volatility. That's the headline. Tier 2, U.S. support, important, but not the backbone. The U.S. is included, but not positioned as the sole guarantor. Support centers on logistics, arms, transfers, intelligence, cooperation, financial backing, but enforcement? The backbone sits in Europe. Tier 3, economic and institutional integration, Ukraine's accelerated integration with European defense and economic systems, anchoring long-term stability in Brussels, not Washington. So the message is unmistakable. Europe is building a security architecture that can survive U.S. inconsistency, not out of anti-American sentiment, but out of necessity. 35. Why Europe decided it needed a backup host. European leaders didn't wake up one day and decide to sideline the U.S. for fun. They learned the lesson the hard way. They watched the U.S. exit major agreements. They watched allies abandoned in conflicts. They watched planning collapse. And now they watched a ceasefire dissolve almost instantly. So Europe is saying, we'll work with the U.S. when possible, but we cannot base our security on a system that swings wildly every election cycle. That's not an insult. It's a survival strategy. 35 to 12:10, Davos, the quiet admission host, and as described at Davos, multiple officials privately acknowledged something that would have sounded unthinkable years ago, that EU and NATO commitments are now viewed as more reliable than U.S. commitments because they're institutional, consensus-based, and harder to reverse overnight. That's the kind of line that doesn't explode on social media, but it reshapes the world because credibility is the core of deterrence. And when credibility erodes, so does influence. 10, 14, 30, Iran. Example, threats before talks. Host, the same credibility problem is playing out with Iran. The U.S. proposes renewed talks over Iran's nuclear program, and simultaneously, senior officials publicly threaten military action before negotiations even begin. Here's the issue. Diplomacy relies on signaling seriousness and restraint. Threats before talks signal that diplomacy is secondary to force. It's not leverage. It's a contradiction, because if the message is negotiate or else, then you're not building trust or stability. You're turning diplomacy into a countdown clock, and Iran's leadership notices, the region notices, allies notice, and then everyone has to ask the same uncomfortable question. If America's word can flip instantly, what does security guarantee even mean? 30, 16, 20, Venezuela. Example, force without a plan host. Then there's Venezuela. As described in your segment, after U.S. military action removed a country's president, Washington ends up in an uncomfortable position, having to take remaining leadership at its word, without legitimacy, without a clear transition plan, and without international consensus. This is what happens when diplomacy is sidelined in favor of force. You lose leverage, you lose allies, you lose control of outcomes, because power without planning creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by chaos, rival factions, and unintended consequences. Strategic leadership means long-range thinking, and when long-range thinking is replaced by short-term spectacle, the results don't just look bad, they become dangerous. Chapter 18:10. The world adjusting moment, key emotional peak, host, slower, heavy. So the collapse of the Ukraine ceasefire isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the world adjusting to the reality that U.S. diplomacy is no longer assumed to be functional. Allies are hedging. Europe is leading, NATO is restructuring guarantees, and American influence, once automatic, now has to be rebuilt. Diplomacy doesn't fail all at once. It erodes over time. It erodes when promises stop meaning what they used to. And right now, the world is responding accordingly. 10, 19, 15. Strong wrap-up. Bring it home. Host, if you want to understand the next decade of geopolitics, watch what allies do, not what leaders say. And what allies are doing right now is building structures that don't collapse when Washington becomes unpredictable. That's a seismic shift. And if the United States wants to lead again, it's going to have to restore the one thing it's hemorrhaging: credibility. 1520. Gear 0. CTA, high conversion, not cringe. Host. If you found this breakdown useful, hit subscribe, because we're covering these stories in a way the mainstream often doesn't, connecting the dots, explaining the mechanisms, and focusing on what it means next. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think U.S. diplomacy can regain credibility quickly, or is the world already building a future where America is just one player among many? What happens when violence stops being a scandal and starts becoming a strategy? Because right now, many Americans and many people overseas are looking at the United States and asking a question that would have sounded impossible a few years ago: is force becoming a governing tool? 15055. Intro Plus. What viewers will get, host? Welcome back. Today's video connects two stories that, on the surface, look separate: domestic escalation, immigration enforcement growing more aggressive, and public trust eroding fast. International escalation, threats toward Iran intensifying in ways that read less like diplomacy and more like a prelude to conflict. And when you put them together, a bigger picture emerges: a worldview where accountability is treated like weakness and coercion becomes the default solution. Let's walk through what's happening and why it matters. 240. The new phase frame: volatility. Host. There's a growing sense, shared by Americans across the political spectrum and by observers abroad, that the U.S. has entered a more volatile phase: not just polarization, not just loud rhetoric, but something darker: the perception that state power is being used aggressively, and the guardrails that used to slow it down aren't holding the same way anymore. And in 2026, that sense intensified after multiple highly publicized incidents involving immigration enforcement, incidents that have raised serious questions about transparency, accountability, and the use of force. Now, before we go further, one important note: details around these incidents can be disputed, and narratives can get politicized fast. What we can focus on is the pattern described in the public conversation: force first, messaging second, and accountability last. 45. Domestic. When enforcement looks like a security force, host, the first pillar of this story is domestic. In the transcript you shared, the claim is that several people have died in encounters involving ICE so far this year, and that at least some incidents were caught on video and witnessed publicly. What matters for the broader analysis isn't just the number, it's the public perception of what came next. The rapid branding of a victim as a threat, sweeping justification before investigations conclude, and then, when backlash grows, a softer tone without meaningful admission of fault. That sequence, defend, reframe, move on, is what creates a deeper legitimacy problem. Because if the public feels that the burden of proof is placed on the dead rather than on the agents who used force, trust collapses. And once trust collapses, enforcement stops looking like law enforcement and starts looking like an unaccountable domestic security force. 7. FETS. The rights exist selectively argument. Storytelling. Host. The transcript makes a point that hits at the heart of the controversy: that rights can begin to feel selective, existing on paper, but disappearing the moment federal power decides you're the enemy. And when that perception spreads, it doesn't stay confined to immigrant communities. It bleeds into the wider public. Because once the state normalizes exception rules for one group, people start asking, who is next? What counts as resistance? How quickly can a protest be framed as a threat? This is where democracies get tested, not only by laws, but by the habits of power. Fit to 9. 10. Rhetoric shift from policy to punishment, host. Now layer on political rhetoric. The transcript includes statements celebrating large-scale deportation plans and framing them as a major victory, almost like a scoreboard. And regardless of where someone stands politically on immigration, the messaging matters. When leaders talk about enforcement like a spectacle, when it becomes take it to the bank language, policy stops sounding like governance and starts sounding like punishment. That shifts the culture. It tells agencies escalation is rewarded. It tells supporters intensity equals success. And it tells critics questioning tactics equals disloyalty. That's not a recipe for stability. That's a recipe for confrontation. 10-10. Public opinion plus legitimacy crisis, moment host. The transcript then points to something significant. Public opinion reacting. When even friendly or conservative media ecosystems begin acknowledging slipping support for enforcement tactics that can signal more than a PR dip, it can indicate a legitimacy crisis, because legitimacy is different from popularity. Legitimacy means people believe the system is fair enough to accept outcomes they don't like. When legitimacy cracks, politics becomes less about debate and more about dominance. And the answer from the regime, as described, isn't reform. It's rebranding, different spokespeople, different tone, same direction. 1240. Rebranding, not restraint, host. A key idea in your transcript. Removing a controversial official becomes a headline, but the replacement brings no promise of restraint. If the operational philosophy stays the same, treating millions of people as invaders rather than neighbors, workers, or families, then switching personalities changes nothing, because the point isn't the messenger. The point is the method: coercion, fear, and force. And here's where the story pivots, because the same governing style at home starts showing up abroad. 40-1505. Abroad. Iran escalation as coercive diplomacy. Host internationally, the transcript describes escalating confrontation with Iran, statements framed not as negotiation, but as ultimatums. This is one of the most dangerous approaches in foreign policy, coercive diplomacy without credible off-ramps. Because when you publicly threaten devastation while demanding compliance, you're not building a pathway to agreement, you're building a pressure cooker. And the geopolitical risk is enormous. U.S. troops in the region are within range of retaliation. Regional partners worry they'll be caught in the blast radius of escalation. European diplomats brace for a broader crisis that can spin beyond control. And Iran, according to the framing here, signals it won't negotiate under coercion. That's how conflicts begin, not always by design, often by bravado, miscalculation, and domestic political incentives. 5-16-45. Distraction incentive. Careful, not conspiratorial. Host. Now, we have to be careful here. It's easy to drift into speculation. But historically, it is true that leaders under intense domestic pressure sometimes lean into foreign confrontation to change the narrative, because foreign threats can unify supporters and drown out uncomfortable domestic stories. Even the temptation matters, because if domestic legitimacy is eroding, the incentive to shift attention outward increases. And history's warning is grim. These diversions don't conceal disaster. They usually multiply it. 5-18-20. The pattern: force as the default tool host, tight, punchy. When you connect the domestic and international pieces, a consistent worldview emerges. Immigration becomes a battlefield. Protest becomes treated like insurgency. Diplomacy becomes extortion backed by threats. In that framework, accountability is weakness, empathy is betrayal, and power is something you exercise, not something you justify. That's the shift people are sensing. And that's why the moment feels dangerous, not because of one incident or one speech, but because the pattern is starting to look systemic. 2019-30. The most important question: emotional peak host, slower. Here's the most unsettling question: not whether this is the darkest chapter of a single political term, but how quickly the public gets used to it. If citizens can die in federal encounters and be smeared as threats before facts are established, and if war is threatened with casual bravado, then danger isn't situational anymore. It becomes structural, and a country that behaves like that isn't just feared abroad, it becomes feared at home. 30-20-15. Close plus, call to action, safe, respectful. Host, the United States likes to see itself as a stabilizing force, a defender of law and order. But when state power turns inward and outward at the same time, without restraint, without transparency, and without accountability, the results are predictable. More instability, more distrust, and higher risk everywhere. If you want more breakdowns like this, grounded, structured, and focused on what matters next, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, do you think this is a temporary spike in volatility or the beginning of a new long-term normal? Drop your take in the comments. Do you think U.S. diplomacy can regain credibility quickly, or is the world already building a future where America is just one player among many?